Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for a bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
I'm going to look up what factotum means.
I was wondering how long
one of these days I'll actually look it up. But
it's so weird. I guess we're at the same wavelength because as I said that, I thought. I wonder how many listeners have.
I'm sure it's something really good.
I thought it was fitting. I wanted a term that I felt would fairly encompass your connection to the GOP, and I think it was the closest I could.
No, that is. And I think, as I understand it, it means sort of like stand-in, sort of spokes kind of person.
You're not like an office holder, but you've kind of been around and you're a supporter. And now some people would say there's kind of take a kind of a toady-ish sort of thing. And that's certainly not my intent behind that. I just thought it was the best word we have in English to describe your relationship to the party. So there we go. So anyway, it's been a few weeks since we've done a listener question, comment, critique episode, and we have some responses or some questions building up. So if you're ready, we'll get right to it, Jay.
All right, let's have at it.
Okay, we'll start with Amy, who tweeted the following question for Jay. She says, Jay, you spoke a lot about people being able to choose their own health care, which Amy says she agrees with. My question is, do you feel the same regarding debate over Roe versus Wade? So in other words, just to be clear, Amy is saying you're pro-choice on healthcare. Are you pro-choice on contraception, on reproductive rights, that sort of thing?
On contraception, I would say definitely I am. On abortion, I would say from a personal standpoint, I oppose abortion. But I am also a constitutionalist. And at this point, there is a constitutional right to abortion within the pre-viability stage and, pursuant to whatever state's laws that have been upheld or that you live in. So in that sense, yes, if you've got, if you want that personal choice, and it's a choice that I disagree with, but I can't be the person to make it for you. You ought to have your choice of providers. And I would say certainly 100% on contraception. I think, you can put abortion maybe into a different category in terms of healthcare, because as the Supreme Court recognized, there are two interests at stake there. It's not simply your health care. The court has recognized that there is a right of the fetus, that the fetus does have certain rights, and that there's a tipping point somewhere in there where the one right they balance, or in some cases the right of the fetus would supersede the right to certain procedures. So, that's where I am. So, from a personal level, like I said, I'm against it, but. I'm sure. Did I answer the question, Mike?
I believe you absolutely did, and I think it was very, very clear your position, and it's essentially my position as well. I certainly don't feel at all like I should be able to make that choice for anyone, and so I think the whole idea of pre-viability, there are these, certainly women can make that choice. And again, especially not being a woman, I feel particularly unwilling to make that choice for anyone, because I fundamentally believe in freedom, certainly. But I also understand your point about post-viability, these competing rights that have to be weighed. And
I think I would probably draw the line there as far as where those rights balance, different than where Amy would.
Yeah, and maybe different where I would, and some people certainly are very radical. There are some people, and I don't use radical as bad, just as a descriptor, basically. There are some people who certainly believe that, life begins exactly at the moment of conception, and therefore anything from that moment on, including, morning after pills and so forth, that is in effect murder. And we've talked about that before. And on the other end, I don't know, you might not remember this, Jay, but back a million years ago when you and I were at American University for our Washington semester
Hmm.
thing there. I remember there was a speaker in one of the seminars that I was in who was very the other way with it. And I asked her these questions. I said, well, let's say there was magically a procedure that could poof, take the fetus outside of the woman and raise it, and it would be raised well and healthily and have a wonderful life. Would you still say that the woman could abort that fetus? She was like, oh, yeah. And I thought, well, I don't get that even at all. And this, of course, is an issue where there are radicals on both sides of this issue. And I think you and I, as with so many things, occupy sort of a reasonable, moderate position on this. We're so
Well,
reasonable.
and again, I think there's the way I look at this is, again, I've got some strong personal convictions, but I think we also live in a world, and you have to recognize the legal constitutional constraints of where we are, and sometimes I think it's foolish not to recognize those constraints, and I'm sometimes critical of folks in the pro-life movement who do that, who would propose, bans that are sort of, punitive or something like that. That's clearly not going to be ruled constitutional. And they do that instead of something that, like making adoption easier, that might, I think, further the pro-life cause better.
Right. Absolutely. All right, moving on. Chris wrote in on our Facebook page to take issue with Jay's comments on Donald Trump's strategy toward North Korea. Specific, I think it's very fitting, given that by the time this episode is released, the conference will have been, well, we'll see what happens. I don't know. The world will hopefully not be in flames. But anyway, Jay's, you remember, Jay, your comment that Trump playing hardball brought North Korea back to the negotiating table. In response to this, Chris writes, they already were at the table. Trump left the table while North Korea stayed. Now you give him credit for just coming back and framing it as some sort of three-dimensional chess strategy. I commented back, I responded back on that to Chris, that I thought, Jay, that you almost certainly didn't think that Trump is a geopolitical genius. I feel pretty safe in saying that, but rather that his unconventional style kind of fit this particular situation, kind of by happenstance, maybe. And Chris replied to that, I can't deny Trump's unconventional style and wouldn't even try. It's a fact that he is unconventional. But letting Jay get away with saying he played hardball to get them back to the table is objectively untrue. It's not a question of opinion, it's just factually untrue. I appreciate your bipartisan effort so you guys have a conversation where both sides don't just talk past each other, but it's of little value when one side outright lies and you let him get away with it. Don't confuse objectivity with neutrality.
Well, I think I don't think I'm lying. I mean, again, let's set a couple things in place in terms of, what you and I talk about here is we largely give our opinion, our commentary, our read on stuff. It's not lying to say I think Donald Trump's approach works with Kim or seems to work with Kim. The other piece that I would respond with is, let's take a look at what we're talking about. Initially, we said, Kim, as a precondition to having any kind of a summit, we want a commitment, an agreement that you are going to work towards dismantling your entire nuclear program. There was sort of the blowback of he wasn't going to do that, and there was some belligerence, and then he said, well, because you guys had ships in this area and all, anyway, there was some back and forth, and then Trump pulled away. And then we've come back to this idea that a prerequisite, and we'll see if this actually holds up, to this summit is the dismantling of the nuclear program. So I think Trump held firm on that. He wasn't going to let Kim get away with anything of, okay, well, we'll keep some of our nukes and we'll have the summit. Now, that I'm not saying that doesn't end up as a final result. Just because negotiations have a way of taking on a life of their own. But I think Trump was right in holding Kim's feet to the fire and saying, making him come back with that what's called a pseudo commitment. That the reason he's coming to talk is that we're talking about a dismantling of North Korea's nuclear program in exchange for recognition and security for Kim. So in that regard, I'm still where I am. I think Trump's doing okay with Kim. And again, I think his style, whether it is intentional or whether it's just accidental, that this happens to be the kind of guy that approach works with. I think so far it's been a good one.
Yeah, and certainly by the time this show,
again, let's compare. Let's go back a couple months when the narrative in the press was that Trump has brought us to the precipice of nuclear war with North Korea. And now we're having a summit about the Koreans dismantling their entire nuclear program. Again, that may or may not happen, and the devil's going to be in the details, and there's going to have to be a lot of inspection, compliance, and all that. And as Trump pointed out, that's going to be the hard part. It's going to be years working that out. But I don't think I was lying about it. I mean,
I think my sense was that I think Chris is right in the sense that Trump's hard talk didn't bring North Korea back to the negotiating table, but your larger point that Trump's hard-lined approach may have actually brought North Korea to the bargaining table in the first place. I think that's a point where I don't necessarily agree with that, but I certainly think it's a reasonable argument, and we'll see.
I think what I'm saying is I think it got them to agree to certain kind of terms of engagement, at least in this process, that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll see how that plays out. Like with so many things, I think we're impatient to know if this was the right call, and we want to make instant judgments and so forth. But even if this summit goes spectacularly well, it's going to be years before we really know, because of just the nature of these sort of inspection and verification regimes. So, and
I'm also I'm going to throw in just this old kind of like political chestnut sort of apocryphal story that supposedly that Henry Kissinger, when he met with Zhou Enlai, they were talking over dinner as these very smart people do, and he asked Zhou Enlai, what's your opinion of Napoleon's influence on history? And supposedly Zhou Enlai replied, "Too early to tell." So, I mean,
yeah, I mean, there are time frames and there are time frames, but certainly this is certainly too early to tell, we can say, I think. All right, James from Dublin, Ireland writes, "Hey, politics guys, I've been a listener of your show now for a couple of months, and before I go any further with this, I just want to let you guys know how much of a good job I think you all do. Keep it up. As a postgraduate political science student listening from Ireland, it's always interesting to tune in and listen to you flesh out the issues of the day." Thanks, James. So here's his question. I was wondering I wanted to get your input on viable ways forward for the Democrats come 2020. As you may or may not know, Ireland has just undone a constitutional ban on legislating for abortion. This is commonly referred to as the Eighth Amendment and made legislating for abortion next to impossible. What's been really interesting to watch is how both camps were able to mobilize the youth vote. It's probably fair to say that those who were in favor of repealing the Eighth Amendment from the Irish Constitution were able to tap into the more liberal viewpoint of the young vote. I'd be curious to get your guys' take on what, if anything, the two parties in the U.S. could do to mobilize a voting base like this. One of the things I hear so much about from listening to U.S. politics shows and reading articles is the level of voter apathy. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on what both parties could do to change some of this, possibly picking up where Bernie Sanders left off. All right, well, I guess that question is, well, for both of us, but maybe more for me than for you, Jay, since James
you start.
I think it's being done. Donald Trump has been spectacular for voter apathy. We've seen already in some of the special elections and in the primaries, Democrats are very energized and so forth. And speaking as a political scientist, one of the things that we know is that people most often tend to vote when they feel they have some big reason to vote, when they're upset about something. That's what energizes people, those strong emotions. And so when you get a situation where maybe, for instance, most commonly, the economy's doing poorly, or when there's a president who say women feel is, or minorities feel is very strongly against them, whether that's true or not, in fact, that will get people energized. But there have been a lot of efforts, various get out the vote efforts and so forth, but without that sort of emotional component to energize people on their own, it's really difficult to create that out of nothing, I would say. But I think, again, I would say the beauty of our system is that when one side goes too far, when you get kind of a radical outlier like a Donald Trump or someone like that, people respond to that. And I think we're going to see Democrats come out in record numbers. And that's going to be a good thing for not just for the Democrats in 2018, but I think fundamentally that's a good thing for Democratic governance. Jay?
Yeah, I sort of agree, sort of disagree. On the one hand, I think so much of American politics turnout, it tends to be personality driven rather than issue driven. Again, you get these senses sometimes, again, whether the economy is going bad, that you'll get more wave election type situations of, hey, we want to change. It's that famous question in the polling that are things going well, not so well, that kind of thing.
Are you better off now than you were 2 years ago?
Right direction, wrong direction. Yeah. So I think that figures in a lot. Because there's typically a subset of hardcore Republicans, hardcore Democrats who are always going to turn out and they're always going to vote the party line. It is getting those folks who are less enthused, and they either need to get enthused by the feeling that something has to change, or because of they are attracted to the personality of a certain candidate. And I think Trump brought in some of those people, both on the change sense and the personality sense. You may dislike his personality, but you can't disagree that he has one, as opposed to, say, like a Michael Dukakis or someone like that. So there's that. The thing that I think that is a little weird right now is Trump in some ways has pushed this Democratic turnout, but he's also driven it farther left, which I think is a bad strategy, Democrat-wise. And maybe it's not a strategy, it's just that's kind of what's happened. Where the Democrats have had success in this interim period has been when they've nominated folks who are more moderate Democrats, who are not necessarily social justice warriors, but so we'll see how that plays out as we actually go. But
well, Jed, that brings up an interesting point, and I'll get a little political scientisty here. Back when you and I were coming up a million years ago, again, the conventional wisdom about how to win re-election was to basically solidify your base and move toward the center to try to bring in the center and get those voters. But that's changed an awful lot over the last 20 years. It's now
energize your base.
Exactly. Don't even worry about the center, basically, and just kind of drive turnout amongst your base. And if you can depress turnout amongst the other person's base, that's fine too. We've seen more and more of that. And part of that, some would argue, is because of congressional gerrymandering and self-sorting in the districts. There have been some various other changes and so forth. But that now is the preferred strategy for more and more politicians. And I would argue, as clearly I say you would agree, that is not, maybe while that's short-term useful and helpful, in the long term, I think it's not only self-defeating, but it's bad for the country.
Yeah, no, I'd agree on that. And I think the other, part of that, the reason that tends to work better than it used to, is because of, one, we've sort of self-segregated ourselves into these districts. The districts have been sort of then gerrymandered, if you want to say, or written around those preferences. It's probably a little bit of both, right? I mean, people have moved where they want to move. And the district lines have followed. And the same goes even on statewide basis, right? I mean, you've had folks who, states have turned more blue, more red, just because of inflow and outflow. There's no gerrymandering in place there. Um, so, yeah, no, I would agree with you, but I'm just looking. If you want to take a look at big elections, presidential elections, you don't see, I would say, with the exception of Barack Obama, any real ideological outliers who tend to win. And Obama, you can make the case, was elected in very much a change year. The economy was in a dramatic downfall. And it was almost like an FDR situation.
But he's not. I mean, I think that's a myth that he's an ideological outlier. He's pretty standard. Fits in with the center leftish.
I suppose.
I mean,
but let's put
Bernie Sanders is an ideological outlier, not Barack Obama. But all right. Well, longtime listener Ryan wrote in to say, I slightly disagree with the idea that Trump, and to an extent the GOP, are more tactical than strategic when it comes to policy. I think when it comes to judges and such, they are not tactical. When it comes to foreign policy and domestic, they are more tactical. They go for the short-term win without thinking about things 30 years down the line, which is what China is currently doing. I think he means thinking long-term there. They don't think short-term. They think for the long-term. I'm curious to see if you guys have any thoughts on this matter.
Yeah, I just said the Joe and lie bit.
I'll say it totally makes sense. My background in American politics is I'm what's called an institutionalist, which means I studied for my doctorate in that political institutions. And
not that you're institutionalized.
Yeah, well, yeah. Institutions drive, in many ways, drive behavior. So when you have institutions that don't require you to seek re-election every 2 or 4 or 6 years, it's easier to plan long term. But if you're always looking toward your next re-election, that's a lot harder to do. And we have an institutional setup that kind of drives a lot of people, especially in the House, toward shorter term, what can get me past the next election sort of thinking. And so I think that's sort of a natural consequence. But that being said, I think there are a lot of other benefits, obviously, to not having, dictators for life, certainly.
Yeah. Well, and to some extent, I would disagree with the premise that foreign policy, we tend to look at the short term. Was that the premise? Or did I
think, yeah, in part, yeah. He said when it comes to foreign policy and domestic.
Or the long term.
So everything, he says judges, we're thinking, the GOP's thinking long term. But when it comes to pretty much not judges, it's like what can look good for the next election or short term, whatever.
Yeah, no, I would disagree a little bit with that. And maybe, again, Trump's the exception. But if you look at American foreign policy, typically foreign policy issues don't turn elections. As a political scientist guy, you'd agree with that, Mike. I think that most elections turn on domestic rather than foreign issues. I mean, there are exceptions, when you're involved in a war and so forth, but in most cases, that's not the situation. And if you look at something like, have we had really changes in foreign policy over the last 50 years? Well, not so much, right? I mean, we have been sort of on a steady, again, with the exception of, let's say, the last 6 months, towards expanded global trade, expanded globalization, more integration of global economies, the continued role as the U.S. as sort of the dominant hegemon militarily that will protect these economic arrangements. And both Republicans and Democrats have supported that line, that trend line.
But President Trump doesn't. And I see what you're saying.
But again, again, this is an exception that we've gotten here. And for example, Democrats, I think, a lot of them will on occasionally raise the protectionist flag over different trade deals. But when it comes down to a vote, they still end up voting for it, or maybe taking a walk, and the thing passes. There's no real change in the trajectory. So
Well,
I differ with the premise on that, and I think that we are more strategic, and maybe whether you call it strategic or whether this is just sort of this is the way these things play out. Um, our foreign policy is pretty consistent long term.
Trump accepted.
Yeah, Trump accepted.
Okay.
Which let's put it this way, even that we don't know if that exception is really going to kick in yet.
Sure.
He's talking, but it hasn't happened yet.
Well, it has happened in the sense of a number of the tariffs. I mean, some of the tariffs that the steel and aluminum tariffs have gone into effect. So we do know that has happened, and there have been retaliatory tariffs. So that aspect of it, yes, that has gone into effect. But
fair enough.
Okay. Let's see. Speaking of trade, regarding a pro-trade post that was made on the Politics Guys page, I think Trey might have made it. He's also joining with us. He's a free trader, certainly. Seth commented, "Is it reasonable to ask who needs who more? I'm closer to the Bernie Sanders view of trade, but it occurs to me that our post-World War II foreign policy has largely been based on the concept of enriching other nations to create more markets for U.S. goods and services, or as a foil to communism. The problem occurs when the building up of the emerging markets comes at the expense of the American worker. Don't those emerging markets need the American consumer at least as much, if not more, than the American consumer needs them?"
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, let's put it this way. I think it's we gain a lot from these emerging markets. Mostly, it's cheap labor, but ideally, I think we end up in a situation where those emerging markets are sort of self-sustaining. I mean, they're spending people buying in their own countries, their own regions. It's not all that they're dependent on the U.S. U.S. is going to obviously continue to be one of the largest purchasers just because of our purchasing power. But if you look at other places that like China or India, which don't necessarily have the per capita income we do, but have such the tremendous population, they also have an outsized role in all this. And I think if I understand the question right, I mean, and maybe I don't. Maybe Mike, you should answer.
Well, I think I have a certain amount of sympathy. I understand what Seth is getting at, but I think the fundamental problem comes when we try to talk about the American worker in isolation. Well, number one, the American worker corresponds to so many people in so many different industries, and some of them are incredibly advantaged by free trade, and some of them, it's much more concentrated group, smaller group, aren't. We see this, for instance, with the tariffs on steel and aluminum. It definitely hurts the American steel and aluminum industry intensely, but there's far greater pain that's spread out a lot more among thousands and thousands.
For example, the auto industry, which then suffers from retaliatory tariffs.
Exactly. And so when we talk about American workers, we need to keep that in mind. Also, we don't want to look at American workers in an isolated way. We need to think about American consumers because, of course, workers are also consumers, and you raise the price of their goods. That is, as many Republicans have pointed out, sort of a tax on them. And so I think the problem comes when we try to look at these things in isolation. I understand the tendency to do that, but we have to look at this as an integrated whole. And what I think economists who study trade have almost invariably found out is that it is true that certain people are hurt when we open up trade. There's no question about that. Certain people, certain industries. But overall, the benefit, not just for these emerging markets, which is the benefit for them has been huge. This lifted more people out of poverty than anything else. And it's been tremendous in that sense. But also there's an overall net benefit to the United States. But when we break it down and look at certain segments that are hurt, yeah, but that's the price of getting that overall benefit. There's no way to not have anyone harmed by that, unfortunately.
Well, and there's also the other piece that we talk about. It's not just that American workers there are jobs lost because they go to foreign countries. Sometimes they're lost because of technological innovation. which is a good thing and a bad thing. And as you point out, because in some cases, this is creating new jobs for the people who create these innovations. It's freeing up labor to do something that may likely be more productive, right? It may be lowering prices for goods for people who buy them, who then may have more money to spend on something else where someone else can work. It's a complex picture, and I guess from me the appropriate conservative Republican viewpoint has always been the government ought to not step in to try to protect one industry over another, to pick winners and losers, as they say, because it inevitably inhibits this free flow, this what's going to happen. Someone is always going to get hurt. The recovery, I think, is quicker when the government stays out of it. And so much the march of innovation. We can't even see what's coming next. And this is funny, Mike. We didn't get to the what I'm reading last week, but mine was going to be in going through some old books while moving my mom. I found a copy of Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, the 1970 edition. And again, this was just kind of fun to just kind of peruse through and see what's come and what hasn't. But it's one of those. There was so much that he saw coming, so much he didn't see coming. And likewise, when the government tries to intervene to say, look, if they wanted to safeguard the lamp makers back in the day, we likely wouldn't have the electric light bulb, and we'd have a lot fewer whales. So that's, to me, is
well, and the standard, I think, free trade promoting response to people who understandably say in objection to that, yeah, but these other countries are protecting their own industries. The standard response is to say, yeah, and that's going to hurt them in the long run. And so if they want to do destructive things, now there's a line, of course, but
they shouldn't. And most of these free trade agreements that we enter into, the WTO, the GATT, and so forth, prohibits those types of let's call it informal, subsidizing your industry and dumping and those kind of anti-competitive things. So yeah, you got to police it.
Yeah.
But
all right. And then next we have, let's see, Dave, who posted the following question on our Facebook page. My question is for Jay and is about regulation in general.
All right.
My politics veer left. To me, history has shown that when capitalism goes unchecked, factory owners chain kids to the factory machines to make them work. Food processors didn't remove rat feces from the meat they were packaging and selling. Isn't it universally considered a good thing that we now have regulations that prevent us from eating rat feces unless we choose? Unless we choose, yeah.
It's sort of a loaded question.
Hold on. Well, it seems obvious that government regulation is a very effective counterbalance to the inevitable abuses that will occur when profit is the only motive. I think that Jay believes undoing Dodd-Frank altogether would be a good idea. Please correct me if I'm wrong about that. And also that Jay wants to eliminate the CFPB, even though it seems that evidence shows that the CFPB is effectively doing its job. It sounds like the knee-jerk reaction is always, regulation is bad. End of story. We already know that Wall Street behaves as responsibly as frat boys at their first kegger, so I'm consistently confounded by these anti-regulation attitudes. Though I'm not blind to the fact that government can be clumsy and regulations can have unintended consequences, they can slow economic growth and stifle some business interests. I'm sure child labor laws really put the hurt on some industries, but that's not a reason to eliminate them, in my opinion. Maybe we are starting with such a different set of presumptions and starting points that I'm missing Jay's points. If you feel like making the time, could Jay please construct a general argument that leads him to dislike government regulation as a rule? I promise I'll check my bias at the door. I really don't understand where he's coming from.
All right.
Have at it, Jay.
Let me first say, I go on record. I oppose eating rat feces
and child labor, presumably.
And child labor. And look, I think to make those. To compare that to, say, the CFPB and Dodd-Frank, that's a bit of a stretch. My position, and look, if you care what my position is, I'm, as Mike says, a Republican factotum. I just sort of give the my impression of what the conservative Republican position is in general, and people can, it's more to illuminate those who might not hear it otherwise. Is that there's of course a role for government to play in reasonable regulation. And if you look at things like child labor, like sanitation, I mean, those are things that were fixed, were changed. And again, some of this is technological innovation. Some of it is changes in our attitudes in society from where they were in the 19th century through the 20th century. But there comes a point where, and this point comes sort of quickly, where the government, when the government steps in to regulate, they often step in to sort of create a winners and losers situation. Mike, and you and I talk about crony capitalism a lot of times. So often, regulations don't really regulate and protect consumers. What they do is they protect the biggest player in the industry who is able to afford those compliance with those regulations. They create a barrier of entry to new players. Here's like a really good example, and this is something I was just arguing locally about a week or so ago. It used to be the city of Cleveland prohibited food trucks. Now I don't know where you live, Mike, but I think the whole food truck revolution has been absolutely fantastic. It creates new jobs. It's a new industry that didn't exist 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's created vibrancy in a lot of communities. It's delicious food. Now, you can say that there ought to be certainly standards, and they ought to be inspected by the health inspector and so forth, and pass those checkpoints. But there were the push against food trucks was from protectionist brick and mortar folks who just didn't want the competition. To me, I don't think that's the proper role of government is to protect one market participant from another. I think that ends up hurting everyone in the long term because you get less innovation and higher prices. And also often lower quality. I mean, we've sort of made this idea, it's central to our antitrust laws, that competition is a good thing. And so often overregulation stifles competition. Secondly, and I guess the other part of this would be, no, I don't think that we need a CFPB. The Republic survived quite well for a long time without it. It doesn't really do much for consumers. It's more a punitive tax on financial institutions. It puts the government more in charge of banks, and if there's, I think that's what troubles me. And it's also the CFPB has like many government entities. Once they sort of get their initial mandate, their first step is to try to expand upon it. For example, the CFPB went into things about auto loan financing and discrimination in auto loan financing when it was clearly outside of what they were supposed to be doing, and they essentially sort of made up evidence to support their claims on that. That to me is a problem, because what it does is it regulates a lot of financiers and makes it harder for people to get auto loans. Maybe not all at once, but over time, that kind of regulation raises the price on everyone else, and it reduces innovation.
Yeah, well, like on so many other issues, I think you and I disagree or agree.
I'm still no child labor.
Yeah, well, we agree, I think, on a lot of the fundamentals. You mentioned the purposes of regulation and the downfalls and that sort of thing, potential downfalls of regulation. And you were saying that, and I was just nodding right along, basically. Where we disagree, and I think where a lot of Republicans and Democrats disagree, is when it comes to the application of that. Like you talk about the CFPB, I would argue that it's much more than a punitive thing. I would argue that affects behavior, and that they have, like, for instance, in Wells Fargo has almost totally tried to remake themselves. I'm so sick of seeing we're a reestablished 2018 Wells Fargo. Well, that was in large part due to the CFPB. So I take all of your points. I think they're important to keep in mind. Certainly
I would say it was also in response to their taking some big market hits, but yeah.
Well, my larger point being that, again, on the fundamentals, you and I tend to agree on that. But when it comes to, well, it's always this question of degree. How much regulation, therefore, is too much? What is too broad of a mandate? Well, people from the left and the right, while we can agree on fundamental concepts, the devil is, obviously in these details. And there aren't clear answers on this, despite what people on both sides will tell you. No one knows how much regulation is too much and how to weigh the costs and the benefits of that, except in truly extreme cases like child labor or rat feces or things like that. But, and that's why I think it's important not to just say, well, I think it was great, Dave, that you said, I check my bias at the door, because I think we need to keep an open mind on this and not just decide government regulation is good, government regulation is bad. We need to consider the circumstance of these cases and be open to the evidence and see what it says about the costs and the benefits.
My last thing that I'd want to add to this, if it wasn't apparent already, the bigger concern that I have is that, governments, and this is sort of a going back to the Lord Acton axiom that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Whenever a government entity has some sort of power, they will exercise it. They will seek to expand it. And Mike, as you said, institutionalist, you can probably say that's part of just the way institutions work, right? And to me, as a conservative that is concerned with personal liberty and the free market, it's the growth of regulation. If you look at the tremendous growth of regulation that occurred, for example, under the Obama administration, and these were things that were not congressional enactments. These were all pieces that were done by rule and so forth. It was expanding exponentially. The cost on business was expanding exponentially. The cost of our government expands exponentially.
Now,
I just think there's a tendency on the left or even on the right of when you have a regulatory institution that it will always want to grow, and that to me is a long-term threat, or at least a threat that ought to be, observed when it comes to when you're balancing that against personal freedom.
Sure. And just to point out, I just want to say that when you say exponentially, you mean a lot, not actually exponentially.
Yes.
Okay. Just because I can hear people just saying,
I haven't done all the math. It may actually be exponentially.
Well, no, it wouldn't be, because exponential expansion, of course, is
before we had two rules. Now we have 4 rules, and
yeah, pretty soon you
rules.
have more rules than there are grains of sand in the universe or whatever. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of rules though.
Yeah, not that. Anyway. All right. Well, that does it for us for this episode. If you do have a question, comment, or correction for us, I just want to know, those like Dave did, I just don't understand this fundamental position that I'm taking or Jay's taking. Just send us an email at mail@politicsguys.com, or you can message us on the Facebook Politics Guys page at facebook.com/politicsguys page, or just, a lot of times some of these questions just come from things you've written in response to some of the things we've posted. All right, and that does it for this episode.
Can I just throw one last thing?
Sure.
I read some Milton Friedman, right? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just throwing that out there, just in general. Anything about Milton Friedman, if you're looking to try to get the rationale of where is this even coming from, that sort of sense is that markets regulate themselves better than governments do, and I'll leave it at that. But I didn't want to just.
No, I get it. Give people the resource.
And curse the darkness, Mike. So.
Look up Milton Friedman on Wikipedia. That's the simplest place to start, and go from there. It's my general advice. But anyway, thanks everyone for listening. We do hope you liked what you heard, and of course, your support critical to keep us going. We really do appreciate it. You know how that works. If you just go to politicsguys.com/support, the direct link, or just go to politicsguys.com and click on support, the Patreon or PayPal links there. Also, subscribing to the show and sharing episodes is very helpful, as is leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes. Again, to get in touch with us, mail@politicsguys.com. There's a Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. We are also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.